I guess I have a pretty abstract question, but so you described the searching behavior that newly introduced animals exhibit when when they're put in a new environment, and I guess how unique are these subpopulations of, say, mountain caribou um, in reference to the spaces that they inhabit?
Right.
You know, do we know enough about that relationship to say that the animals that are translocated from BC to Idaho can establish themselves in an environment that they were not raised in?
Right. Well, that's a good question, and the taxonomy of caribou is a little bit confusing because there are caribou that include barren ground caribou up in the Yukon and Alaska, as well as what we call woodland caribou. But even within the woodland caribou, which is a subspecies of caribou, there are kind of further divided into what's called ecotypes. And the ecotype in the Selkirks is called a mountain ecotype. And those are the ones that they utilize the deep snow in the winter. They get the lift up into the subalpine for canopy and eat lichen. So that's the mountain caribou. There's a northern ecotype, which is kind of a transition between barren ground caribou and woodland caribou. And it exists in areas that has wind-blown ridges, and they're more of a ground forager. The same diet in the winter, it's lichen, but it's more on open wood, wind-swept ridges that they're foraging off the ground. Part of the original transplant, the augmentation that Idaho did, included both northern ecotype and mountain ecotype animals, woodland caribou. And there was actually a grad student that looked specifically at comparing the habitat use, the movement patterns, the survival rates of northern ecotype versus mountain ecotype. And there was a difference. The mountain ecotype they're better adapted to the Selkirks. It's a mountain ecotype habitat. So they didn't move as much, they settled in, they had lower mortality rates. The northern ecotype, on the other hand, did travel more and had higher mortality rates. We took that lesson from the Idaho augmentation effort and applied it to the Washington effort, where we stuck to mountain caribou ecotype. So yeah, there certainly is a difference in caribou. You can't just, you have to think about it. You have to think about what the source population is and what the source habitat is and what the release site habitat is. And the northern ecotype didn't do as well. But so, yeah, I think the reason for the decline of caribou is not that we brought in a different type of animal. We avoided that the second time around. And most of the caribou in that original transplant were mountain caribou anyway. So yeah, I think we did as, with the source populations that were available, we did as good as we could at making sure there was a match between the source habitat and the release site habitat, the Selkirk habitat.
Do you think that even within mountain ecotypes, there are differences that will impact the herd's ability to establish itself in a different environment?
I don't know that there's much of a difference in habitat. I think there's certainly some historical knowledge of animals that have lived in the ecosystem, and that was our hope with the Washington augmentation, that they would become assimilated with essentially what had become resident caribou in the Selkirks, and they wouldn't have to go through that learning curve. They could just assimilate with resident population and kind of save themselves the problem of that learning curve. And it did seem to work a little bit. I mean, the released caribou did find the resident caribou and became assimilated into their herd. So I don't think that was, I don't think that was a big contributing factor. to caribou recovery. I think it was more of this kind of, we've changed the ecosystem to the point where it probably can't support caribou in its current state.
So we read the thesis that you mentioned, Chris Warren's thesis, I think it was. And we were both struck by this searching behavior that was exhibited mostly by the northern ecotype, but also in some instances the mountain ecotype. And for myself, I couldn't help but sense there was, or feel like there was a sense of homelessness that these translocated caribou were experiencing. And I'm just wondering if you think, and maybe it's an out there question, but do you think translocated animals experience a sense of homelessness?
Oh, I think they certainly probably do. I mean, they were, there's a lot of knowledge passed from mom to offspring, seasonal habitat use, where to go at appropriate times, and where the good stuff is. And especially with that, with Idaho's augmentation, they were released further south in the ecosystem than there were resident caribou. So they were kind of off there by themselves. And they were, it was definitely, you're dumped into a new neighborhood, and you're kind of trying to find your way, and you're gonna stumble into some good stuff, but you're probably gonna stumble into some problems too. So I think there's certainly an aspect of the learning behavior. I hate to anthropomorphize too much about, I'm feeling homeless, but certainly it was unfamiliarity with the area, no knowledge of resident caribou to kind of piggyback on and help them. So they were kind of on their own at the start. And that's, I think, why they move so much, and why that you always get that initial surge of mortality, especially when you're trying to establish a population where there aren't any resident caribou or resident animals to associate with.